very much. I'm delighted that you're here, and I'm very excited to be able to talk to you today about Charles Dickens and the place he held in 19th century Britain. I have only one complaint, Kai, and that's my place in the speaking order. I'm following the dynamic, wonderful speaker you had last week, so I'd like to immediately lower the varying expectations. But what I would like to talk to you about, I've titled A Tale of Two Britons, obviously playing on Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. What we are going to talk about is a kind of series of transformations which are really revolutionary. But what's perhaps most remarkable is the absence of political revolution in Britain anyway, to accompany them. What I'd like to set for a task for today is not for me to try and convince you of a certain argument. What I'd like to do is invite you to have a conversation. So I'd like to tell you a little bit, or remind you of some of the key events that happened in Britain during Dickens' lifetime, and then let you know how scholars have disagreed about the interpretations of those events. And I'd like to get you to tell me, since you're reading Dickens, well, which Dickens you find, which scholars' views do you find the most persuasive. Perhaps to start off, we might simply take part of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, one of the most famous beginnings of all novels. And I think Dickens gives us a really important clue about how he viewed his own era. In this bottom part here, you can see the second part that's in bold print. He says, in short, the period, then the revolutionary period in France, was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or evil, in a superlative degree of comparison only. Dickens, like those in France, lived in a truly revolutionary era. So how does life fit in what has been described as an entire century that resulted in the revolution of life, to use Leo Rubel's famous phrase? There are an awful lot of revolutions. We'll have our hands full, mainly, talking about one and a half of these. It's first the Industrial Revolution in its first two phases, and the connection it has to the unfolding agricultural revolution, which had begun in earlier centuries, but which was really picking up momentum during Dickens' lifetime. In terms of political revolutions, however, the 19th century is rife with revolution. In addition to the French revolutions and the Napoleonic Wars, there's a second and then a third major wave of revolutions that sweeps across France and much of Europe in 1830 and again in 1848, to speak of only some of the major political revolutions. At least another revolution in labor occurs early in Dickens' lifetime, when slavery is ended, for the most part, in the British Empire. The latter part of his life was one which also was accompanied by revolutions in political events and the shifting power relations inside Europe. So Britain is embroiled in the Crimean War, together with France and several other powers, against Russia. And it wins, but at tremendous cost. Think of the charge of the Light Brigade, if you will, from which that poem stems. Also, there are revolutions in the organization of European states. The many German and the many Italian states combined, they unified precisely towards the end of Dickens' life. And just as slavery had ended earlier in the British Empire, so too there is an unfolding story of, one hesitates to say an unfolding story of freedom, but at least of greater freedom. Russian serfs are freed in 1861, and in the latter part of the 1860s as well. Slaves are freed in the United States. There will be many flies in the ointment, however. And one of them is that even as many people are becoming freer in places like Russia, in places like the British Empire, in places like the United States, this is also a story of new imperialism. Britain is busy subjugating new parts of the globe, or places that are new to its empire. They're busy introducing more restrictions on the labor, more restrictions on the political freedom of those who become subjects in its empire. Inside Britain, though, Britons did become much more free to shape their own government in a very piecemeal way. In 1832, when Dickens was about 20 years old, one of the most fundamental reforms occurs. The 1832 Reform Act. It got rid of a lot of political abuses. For instance, there were things called rotten boroughs, where very few, or in some cases one, elector would choose a representative for Parliament. Those were done away with. The map was redrawn for electoral districts, and the franchise was thrown, for European standards, wide open. meaning upwards of perhaps 20% of adult males could vote. Still no women. That made Britain one of the more democratic places in the whole of Europe, in fact, in the whole of the world. Certainly, it wasn't enough for many. We'll talk briefly later about a movement called the Chartist movement. Ultimately, some gathered close to 1 million signatures, at least several 100,000 signatures, demanding such things as universal male suffrage. The movement peters out, though, in 1848, the same year that second great wave of revolutions sweeps Europe. What's really telling in all of this, I think, is this untold or underemphasized story that while Britain is busy reforming in a very unsatisfactory, very grudging way, it doesn't have a revolution. There aren't many heads that literally roll. Places like France have a revolution in 1848, but they don't keep the republic they get. It quickly gives way to Napoleon's empire. Places like Prussia and Austria have revolutions. People die in the streets fighting for political reforms, but for the most part, those reforms are gradually stifled in the rest of Europe. This halting, grudging, hugely imperfect set of reforms in Britain sticks. It, in fact, widens. In 1867, there's another great reform act, this time perhaps doubling the electorate. About 40% of adult males were able to vote. By just shortly after Dickens' death in the 1880s, perhaps 60% of adult males would be able to vote. Still no women. In fact, it wouldn't be until after World War I, until 1918, that adult males and women 30 and older would be allowed to vote. But we also have to say there's a lot of nuance here. While there is a gradually unfolding story of greater political freedom inside Britain, the rates vary enormously. So, for example, your chances of being able to qualify through holding enough property or paying enough in taxes to qualify to be able to vote were much higher if you lived in England, much lower if you lived in a place like Ireland or Scotland. That's the central contrast then. Britain gets hugely imperfect reform, but it's mostly peaceful, and it's mostly sticks. It's little wonder that it's precisely in this era that historians begin to write a story of Britain's past that later we come to call Whiggish, playing on a political party. It's a story that tells about the almost inevitable progress that certainly the British, and perhaps all of humanity, were destined to enjoy. It's something which is a kind of heroic narrative, which very few historians would tell today. But given this gradual widening of the franchise, it helps us to understand something of where this perspective on the past comes from. If Dickens had looked around him at monarchs, he would have also seen a bit of a checkered record. When he was a young man growing up, the king was George III, who Americans will know and probably have demonized from the revolutionary past. The British have held a very different view of George III. While his reign did end in periodic bouts of madness, probably driven by disease, and in the loss of the 13 colonies, many British remember him very fondly. He was a very devout person, religiously, and a very devoted family person. This was, for monarchs in Europe, countercultural, if you will. George IV, who succeeded him, also had a bit of a mixed record. While he has a victory over Napoleon, it's while he's regent anyway, that the British oversee the suppression of demands for, surprise, political reforms. In 1819, several people are killed as cavalry rides into a gathered crowd near Manchester in the so-called Peterloo Massacre. The king further provokes controversy by inviting a kind of discussion about whether Catholics might, after several centuries of being excluded in effect from public life, be allowed to be emancipated. He also then stirs the controversy by eventually taking a strong stand against it. George IV really helped to drag the reputation of the monarchy into disrepute because he was very much a pleasure-seeking, fun-loving, sybaritic monarch, quite unlike his father. He, in turn, is succeeded by William III, who was, in his very short reign, responsible for a number of remarkable and ambiguous reforms. For example, the poor law was reformed. But the reform itself was predicated on a system of making the poor live in poor houses, which were supposed to be worse than the alternatives that they could seek outside the poor houses. Since the standards of subsistence were already quite low by this point in Britain, that meant that life in these houses could be quite miserable. So it's well-intentioned reform with some pretty brutal results. Likewise, finally, there are some limits placed on child labor. We'll talk more about that in a minute. This also is a two-edged sword. It's another well-intentioned reform intended to protect children from some abuses in the Industrial Revolution. One of the effects, however, is to further impoverish many of their families who depended on these children. Wages weren't increased for the working mothers or fathers of these children, so in effect they simply had family wages limited. Another well-intentioned reform with some peculiar results. Much more positive, obviously, is the abolition of slavery and the 1832 Reform Act. William is followed by Victoria, who presides for many decades over Britain. Hers is a period in which some of the great differences in income, some of the great disadvantages of belonging to the lower classes began to be eroded, all of that to the good. But as we mentioned earlier, this is also a period when the British Empire is busy subjecting parts of the earth to its rule, creating an empire ultimately so vast that, as the saying went, the sun never sat upon it. Critics of the empire charged this was because God didn't trust Englishmen in the dark. So what I'd like to mainly talk about, having gone through some of those political reforms and some of the major events under various monarchs, is much more the social and economic intersection of the Industrial Revolution with those political reforms. And I'd like to especially get us to think about three major changes that the Industrial Revolution brings about. One is the kind of set of changes that everyone thinks about. It's the efficiency in production, changes in technology and industries. And I'd like to take a single example, the innovation of the steam engine, and get you to think about how that gets applied. So, for example, the steam engine, or at least something like a modern steam engine, is devised by 1712. You can see a picture of it up here in the top part of the slide. It's originally devised to help pump water out of mines. The effect is you can mine deeper. You can extract more coal. The shafts don't fill up with water nearly as much. Eventually, a few decades later, people figure out you can hook up the steam engine to the process of iron smelting. As a result, in just a very few years, iron output quadruples. Eventually, Arkwright Watt devised a system where you could hook up a steam engine to a loom and weave. The result is that in a very few decades, cotton output increases, according to the sources that are indicated there. Cotton output increases 130-fold, not 130%, 130-fold. And of course, eventually someone figures out you can hook a steam engine onto a cart, lay it along tracks, and create railways. When Dickens is a very young man, when he's 18, there are about 157 miles of railroad track in the whole of Britain. By the time towards the end of Victoria's reign, there are about 30,000 miles of track. We'll talk about the implications of that in just a moment. All those seem like they're to the good. And indeed, there's much good about them. But this is also the worst of times, even it's the best of times. Here are a couple of charts that look like more great advances. The one on the top, for example, shows you an increase in production over the whole course of the 19th century. And if you'll notice, apart from a few minor variations, the direction is up, up, up. Industrial production in terms of tons of coal mined, tons of iron smelted, and so forth, rises almost inexorably. Those Whiggish historians have been happy. Likewise, the bottom chart shows us increasing rates of literacy. The top line is for men, the bottom line is for women. Eventually, they converge towards our present. All that is to the good. What's the flip side of that much greater industrial efficiency? Here's one set of contemporaries responded, how they responded to that anyway. In 1786, shortly before Dickens is born, a number of workers put together a petition. There are just 4 of them who dared to sign their name. They claimed to speak on behalf of thousands. What they laid out was some of the cost to them of these enormously more efficient machines. You can read the quote which is here. The claim is that a single machine 1786 would mean 12 unemployed weavers, scriveners, who had done a portion of the process of textile manufacturing. This is the flip side, the darker side. Also, if we continue to explore that notion of changes in technology and efficiency, right, we have to put ourselves back into the world of 1812 when Dickens is born. When Dickens is born, as many have observed, the fastest a human can travel is the fastest a horse can carry her, or the fastest a wind-powered ship can carry him across the water. By the time he dies in 1871, there are railroads which can go 50, in some cases perhaps 60 miles an hour. There are steamships, which actually initially are not faster than many of the wind-powered ships, but can sail up river currents, even in the ocean where there are doldrums. It provides a regularity and eventually a much greater speed. When Dickens was born in 1812, the fastest most humans could communicate anyway would have been through a letter over long distances. The earlier form of the telegraph, though, had been worked out by 1837 and onwards. You can communicate almost instantaneously. One example of how this affects communication then is to say, for example, when the intercontinental telegraph cable is first laid in 1858, you can communicate in just a very few moments. It's almost as rapid to them as the internet is to us. This cut off about a 10-day journey by boat, which would have been the fastest that you could have otherwise sent a letter from Europe to the United States or vice versa. What do contemporaries make of these changes? They're certainly staggering in their ability and their proficiency, but they're also off-putting in a variety of ways. Famously, later in the 19th century, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Francis Joseph, said, for example, he hated the telephone. Because, he said, you can't be emperor on the telephone. You couldn't wow your audience in your resplendent military uniform, decked out with medals, set amid your castle. These new technologies, like the telegraph and later Franz Joseph's telephone, disembody communication. They are liberating, they are democratizing, and precisely for that reason, they're also very off-putting to those who have a vested interest in the old technologies. A second major way that the Industrial Revolution changed things is it changed fundamentally how humans work. For example, many became more specialized in their labor, as Adam Smith had predicted, but it also meant the undoing of a variety of special skills people had developed. Being a weaver was far less valuable if you were competing against cheaper products made by machines, for example. This mechanization of labor made for tremendous gains in efficiency. Again, think of the workers' petition. At the same time, it led to a transformation of the way people worked and where they worked. In the factory system that's devised, we see a reversal of the way labor had been organized. In prior eras, for example, just before Dickens had been born, there had been a lot of industrial production using, for example, the putting out system. Now, workers are gathered to a central place where you have an expensive machine like a steam engine hooked up to machines. This transformation, taking them out of their homes where they might have done their labor and moving them into factories, was one change. But perhaps a still more revolutionary change was what the great historian E.P.A. Thompson called work discipline. In the putting out system, people working in their homes or in smaller factories or workshops would have had a lot of control over exactly what they did at any given moment in the day. They could have controlled the pace of their work. They could have taken breaks when they wanted or needed to. They would have taken a lot of their cues from nature, from the rising of the sun, from the seasons outside. With the factory system, we see a greater degree of uniformity. It's what we see is people being controlled by the clock. We see people being transformed and overseen in every aspect of their labor. And many workers found this to be very off-putting. This led some contemporaries to worry about the effect of the Industrial Revolution. William Blake famously, in the early 1800s, wrote about the dark, satanic mills. belching out their smoke, enslaving the laborers, perhaps. There was, in fact, a great deal of child labor. But we have to be careful. It wasn't new for children to work in Britain. In fact, most people, most families, depended on essentially every able-bodied person in the family to work in some way to contribute to the family economy. But as people began to move out of rural and agricultural settings, and in much greater numbers into cities and into industrial work, we see a transformation in the kind of labor and in the hours of labor and in the degree of parental control over labor. There are a lot of kids who work. Jane Humphreys recently has estimated that in Britain, by the early 19th century, maybe 15% of the whole labor force was comprised of children. Men and women also work, but there too we see some surprising changes develop. Employers often could get away with paying women and certainly children lower wages than men. As a result, many men who had been bread earners for their family became unemployed or underemployed. Women took on a much greater role, and in one sense, this is the best of times. This means a great liberating element. If women have access to wages, they in theory could exercise a greater degree of control of influence within the family. But it's also the worst of times. In many cases, property laws are such that women have far less control over these wages. The men in their lives, even if unemployed, controlled a great deal of economic assets. As well, transformations in labor are brought about by the abolition of slavery we talked about, and so too, in part at least, by something that happens in 1832, the same year of the Reform Act. Parliament gathers a committee together. It's called the Sadler Committee. They interview a lot of witnesses to find out what working conditions are like. This occurs then when Dickens is 20 years old. He's a young man looking around. And it's not been that long since he's been engaged in a similar kind of labor himself. And in the Sadler report, I'll show you an excerpt in just a moment, the parliamentary committee concludes that there are abusive working conditions, and the result is a Reform Act, the 1833 Factory Act, that seeks to improve working conditions. The best of times. A problem has been recognized and it's been dealt with. But it's also the worst of times. It was a hugely imperfect act. It had very few people to regulate it, to enforce it. It requires many other factory acts in all those years you see indicated there to come close to properly regulating industrial labor. What do the workers have to say about this? Less than we might think, based on the sources that are left behind, but remember the lower literacy rates. And also remember this, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for workers to organize. In 1799, in the Combination Act, unions had been in effect outlawed. There's a brief loosening of this around 1824 until it's reintroduced again. Even though the restrictions on forming unions and the actions of unions had been eased, though, after 1824, it's not really until 1867 that unions are finally fully allowed. In the meantime, many people are promoting critiques. There are varieties of socialism. The most famous one we know, of course, is that devised by Marx and Engels. They dismiss the earlier attempts by people like Robert Owens, who Dickens would surely have known about, and who was active in reforming Britain as well as the US. He dismisses them as utopians and promotes his own scheme as sure and scientific. After Dickens' death, other socialists come along, including the so-called Fabians, who are interested in reforming. So let's go back to that child labor. What was it like, exactly, to be a worker, especially a young child, in one of these factories? Well, not bad, if we believe Andrew Urey, who was a professor of technology. He claimed to have visited many mills in and around Manchester. What he claimed was there wasn't any abuse of children. And instead, he had observed that they were cheerful and alert, taking pleasure in the light play of their muscles. He also claimed that the workers hadn't any interest in unions, but the unions bullied them into striking. This is after the Factory Reform Act of 1833. In 1832, the Sadler Committee found testimony like this, of an adult who now was able to talk about what his experiences had been like as a 6-year-old child. You can read it as well as I. What he tells you is essentially they were beaten, and this was hardly uncommon. This may have resonated with Dickens, whose father was confined to a debtor's prison for a while. And in order to help his family meet ends, Dickens had to work maybe 10 hours or so per day. And those work hours would have been pretty typical. 10, 12, even 16-hour days were quite common for ordinary workers in mines, in factories, in the early Industrial Revolution. What about the poor? David Ricardo devised the famous so-called iron law of wages, arguing in effect that the law of supply and demand indicated that workers would in effect always see their wages reduced to the lowest level necessary to sustain them. He argued, therefore, that if you wanted to intervene, create a kind of a state system to benefit the poor, you were working against the very laws of economics itself. His conclusion then is for the government to do, in effect, nothing, or next to nothing. He argues that the poor houses and the poor laws needed radical reform in order to prevent the poor from multiplying. Others, much poorer than Ricardo, who had made a fortune on the stock market, said, we demand the vote. We demand universal suffrage. Remember, this is still when Ricardo was writing, even before the Reform Act of 1832, when 20% of the adult males were allowed to vote. Marx put it more, together with his co-author Friedrich Engels, put it much more concisely. He concluded the Communist Manifesto with these famous words: workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The third set of major changes that the Industrial Revolution occasioned is changes in the way people live. Population grows by staggering amounts. I'll show you another chart in a minute, but when Dickens is born, the population of England and Wales and Scotland is something close to 12 million or so. By the time he dies, it's about 25 million or so. Where do you put them all? The size of cities like Manchester and Leeds doubled and tripled in size in the space of a generation. This rapid urbanization called attention to major problems. It's difficult to say whether there was a greater percentage of the poor, but the poor become at least much more visible in these swelling urban centers. Hygiene, public sanitation is horrific. It takes decades for the cities to catch up to this rapid growth. Another change in the way people lived is through the growth in new classes, which Marx and Engels commented on, observing that there had been many classes in the past, but in their era, the middle classes and the working classes were swelling in number and in influence, especially the middle classes in influence. This, Engels had claimed, led to lots of pressure on family life, as, for example, men were thrown out of work and women became breadwinners. Engels didn't mind this at all, but it did create a certain amount of tension with the bourgeois Victorian values of the period. So did the rigid class stratification. Early sociologists like Ferdinand Tönnies and Max Weber said this is what this then amounts to. What we see in the pre-industrial era is a world in which most people live in places where they know most people around them. They are in tight-knit communities. They don't go very far from where they're born. They live in a kind of community. Instead, people move into cities where they don't know each other as well. They might not know the people around them. They have a transformation. They relate only in very abstract and attenuated ways. They become a society. The experiences certainly were also very different for men and women in the different classes. In Dickens' youth, one of the hallmarks of being a middle-class family was having a servant, at least one if you could afford it. Another hallmark was having the mother of any children in the family not work for a wage outside the home. And this is one of the first times, maybe the first time in human history, when a very large number of people are able to afford unpaid labor outside the home. The way sociologists often put this is to say what we see is something remarkable. In the past, the site of production, where people had earned their money and earned their living, had always been very close to the site of reproduction for the family. For the middle class, at least, these two things are brought apart. Middle class men often go out into the world, out into the city, out into the factories to earn their living, and their family is a place they come back to. Women are, in the middle class, supposed to be of a higher moral standing. They're supposed to be the angels who redeem the men who have had this sharp-elbowed competition in the world. There were no such views, for the most part, about working class women, who were also supposed to work and had to sustain their families. Another radical change is a change in the perception of time and indeed of space itself. When Dickens had been born, before there was the railroad, most people indeed never went more than about 30 miles or so from where they were born. Suddenly, with the new technologies available, many people do. The effect of that, scholars have claimed, is to essentially obliterate space. Where you came from suddenly mattered much less, as you could quickly move from one part of the country to the next. You could escape the law. You could seek job opportunities. It made you much more mobile, even as your place in a class that made you much less mobile. Even the perception of time itself could be altered as people become less accustomed to the rising and setting of the sun, the cues of the church bell ringing to announce lunch, the cues of the seasons to signal what sort of labor you should perform. And they become much more used to the factory bell, the factory whistle, the time clock kept by their managers. So it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. Look, here's the promise chart showing you the rapid increase in population. Something must be going right if suddenly a country can sustain a much larger population. Something must be going right in the cities. By 1851, probably, more Britons lived for the first time in towns and cities than in the countryside. Even Marx was grateful to capitalism for this. He said it had freed people from what he called the idiocy of the countryside. His writing partner Engels had a different take. After viewing some of the sections of Manchester, he concluded that many of the people who were seeking places to dwell and employment in those swelling cities were in effect living in desperately poor, awful slums. Both of these Britons existed. Both of them are Dickens' world. Dickens is a world which produces the most stunning advances in technology. By 1851, in the famous Crystal Palace exhibition, which Dickens would certainly have been aware of, what we find is written as the so-called workshop of the world. It showcases its technology. Other nations come to learn, to emulate Britain's great example in productivity. At the same time, I'd like you to pay attention to the worst of times, if you will. That chart on the other side shows you the population of England going up and up, and of Ireland going down. Why? Because this is also the period of the Great Irish Famine. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people starve, still more immigrate. So, what do we make of this? Scholars have looked at how long people have lived, how much income they've earned, these kinds of things that we find many, many references to in Dickens' writing, have concluded different things. For example, Jackson, in a famous analysis, argues it's the best of times and the worst of times. First, the worst. There were tremendous inequalities in incomes and in lifespans of people up till about 1867 or so. After that, Jackson found through a really rigorous statistical analysis, things start to even out. The poor and the working classes start to increase their income fairly rapidly. They close the gap. What we see then is a tremendous growth in wealth, enormously wealth created in England. Also a tremendous increase in the size of the middle class. By the end of the 19th century, Britain has probably the proportionally largest middle class in the world, maybe 20% of the population. By the end of the 1800s, after Dickens' death, even workers have rising real wages. The Industrial Revolution is benefiting them too, not merely with cheaper goods that are available, but now with much higher incomes that let them be able to afford some of those things. What we also see is another fly in the ointment. Britain, by the second half of the 1800s, is beginning to decline relative to the rising industrial powers. By 1914, both Germany and the United States overtook Britain as leading industrial powers. So where does this leave us? We've had kind of an overview of the effects of the Industrial Revolution, the social and economic effects, matched up with the political reforms in Britain. Well, it leaves us with a lot of questions that scholars have answered in really different ways. Here are some of the questions that have exercised them. Did the economic and social changes during Dickens' lifetime, during this middle of the 19th century, add up to a worsening of material conditions? Almost no scholar would argue things were good in the early Industrial Revolution when Dickens is writing for ordinary workers. What they have disagreed about bitterly is whether things were actually getting worse, or we simply have better records to prove that they were at least as bad as during the earlier eras. They've also answered this question differently. How do those social and economic changes fit with the political changes, such as the extension of the franchise? They've also puzzled over this. Why is it that Britain develops very strong unions in the end, but it doesn't have a strong orthodox Marxist movement? We also want to pay some attention to another issue that has exercised scholars. How is it that the issues of class inside Britain are connected to issues of class and race outside of it? The Irish, for example, were considered often to be, in the United States as well as in Britain, to be black, because to be white was to be associated with civilization. It was to be associated with those markers of, in many cases, middle-class values. Britain's conquest of large new areas of the world helps to fuel the Industrial Revolution, which eventually benefits enormously the population, but which has these terrible side effects in the first few decades of it. Scholars have also given radically different answers to the question of why the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain first. Was there a British exceptionalism? Was there something unique, maybe better, about the political culture? Was there instead a kind of happy accident for Britain, a series of natural factors like shrinking forests that had been mismanaged that made the British turn to coal? Innovations in coal made them turn to the steam engine and so forth. Had the British sort of blundered their way into the Industrial Revolution? And then, of course, there's the central problem. Why is it that the British, who have such an advance, such a lead in the Industrial Revolution, why is it that they lose it and become eclipsed by both Britain, by both Germany and the United States? So the changes we've talked about fit with the central period of productivity for Dickens' life, from roughly the 1830s to about the 1860s, maybe 1865 or so. So what I want to ask you is, as you read through those, which Dickens are you reading? Here's one take. It's by Karl Marx. He argued, here's what Dickens, as well as a number of authors have done. I'm going to read the parts at the bottom. He had argued that they had painted the middle class as full of presumption, affectation, petty tyranny, and ignorance. And the civilized world had confirmed their verdict with the damning epigram that it is fixed to this class, that they are servile to those above and tyrannical to those beneath them. George Bernard Shaw apparently thought that Dickens' writings were more revolutionary than Marx's work Capital. Other scholars are not so sure. Patrick Brandlinger, for example, says this: there can be no doubt that Dickens was concerned with the factory question throughout his career, but the shape which his concern takes in the novels is unsatisfying to many readers, for it seems to justify Ruskin's jibe about his membership in the steam whistle party. It's simple to prove that Dickens supports that party, for his speeches are larded with praises of British industry. So, I'd like to invite you into a conversation. Which Dickens are you reading? And what have you seen in your reading that connects to these social and economic changes, to the Industrial Revolution and its unfolding effects? If you want some other resources, I point you towards some of these, but there are also many here in the library, which Lisa can point you to. So, what kind of questions, comments, and outraged responses do you have?
I wonder if you would speak a little bit to efforts on the part of the British government or religious groups or social groups for social ways of ameliorating the problems of housing and labor efforts, church, for example, and other ways in which there were movements to fight against.
There truly were. And I think that's, for the most part, as I said, a story of good intentions and some pretty imperfect results.
Whoever is the question,
Well, certainly. The question was, can you speak to the efforts on the part of the government to ameliorate the conditions, the living conditions, the working conditions of some of those people in the factories and mines?
And the social displacement of people also.
As well as the social displacement of those individuals. And there were indeed lots of good intentions efforts. And some of those we really briefly looked at, right? One was this set of the reform of the poor laws. Ricardo argued it was a foolish mistake. Certainly it is true that I believe most historians would agree with this, that the poor houses that were set up then, however well-intentioned they may have been, really led to a pretty bleak existence of the poor. And that was part of the design. Things were not supposed to be cushy. They were supposed to be enough to keep body and soul together, but not enough to make you want to stay very long. You were supposed to subscribe then to those values that we now call Victorian. You were supposed to use your own industry, your own thrift, your own gumption to work your way out of the poor house. So there were such efforts. It's easy to look back and say, well, for example, some of the efforts by the government to prevent workers from unionizing or striking seem exploitative, and in the end they may be. To look at, to try and recover something of the worldview of some of those who defended those positions in that era, though, we might want to look at liberal theories of contract labor. The position of those who said they opposed unionization for the benefit of the workers was, if you'll believe it or not, that unions reduce the freedom of individual workers to work and bargain for their own wages. Everybody was to be paid the same or similar wage, and so it was seen as, by those people, as a terrible affront on the individual's ability to use thrift and industry and gumption to rise above less productive workers. So those sets of policies indicate really carefully reflected and rational choices. Whether we think those are well-intentioned, or whether we think that's a cover for the advance of class interest, well, their scholars have radically disagreed.
Well, I'm not pushing too far. What about non-governmental efforts to make things better?
Dickens is part of that. So, for example, in his lifetime, he actively raises funds for a hospital to try and keep it from going bankrupt, successfully in the end. He also, in writing in a way that dramatizes the pretty bad conditions of debtors' prisons and so forth, probably contributed to the closure of some of those institutions. Likewise, there were great reformers like William Wilberforce, who used his Christian theology to advocate for the abolition of slavery. So, if you will, there's a laissez-faire approach to reform in this regard. Many individuals voluntarily organized to try and advocate for change, and Dickens is certainly, I think, a part of that process. He, in that way, is really a product of his own world. He is not apparently somebody who was terribly interested in socialism, even though Marx apparently thought he was one of several authors who had exposed the middle classes in remarkable ways. And there we get into some interesting questions that I'd like to get your responses on. When we think of the author's intent, of Dickens' intent, versus the effect of his reading on you, I wonder how you read him. Is he somebody who in the end is kind of affirming the social and political order of Britain? His is a kind of steam valve approach in mocking and caricaturing certain aspects. He affirms it. Or is he really underlying? What other questions?
It would appear that fossil fuel or coal was 100 years ahead of the United States. I don't know if it's true or not. 1850 and then maybe 1950 years, say. And that Britain was fueling, naval ships with steam power and so forth.
Absolutely. And so this has occasioned a lot of reflection on history. Why is it that the British, of all people, and Europe of all continents, is at the forefront of this? For example, Pomeranz has argued China might have emerged as a leading power in the Industrial Revolution. why does it happen this way in Britain? So one response to that is to emphasize the kind of story of nature, is that Britain, being an island, couldn't keep expanding its territory very well in Europe. It had a limited number of forests, and it did not manage them very well. So it's running out of wood, and therefore the ability to make charcoal that will help it refine metals. So it has to find some other source. And so it happens to be coal, and coal in Britain happens to be close to the surface, and it happens to be sort of close to the iron deposits too. So it may simply be a happy accident of history for them that all these things are there. Other scholars argue, well, there's something different about the British culture. It's more entrepreneurial. The culture of the rule of law was more deeply established in Britain. That led to inventors being willing to invest in their research and their products and so forth. So there may be something of a human directive response there to explain why the British emerged with initially better technologies and including why they adopted wholesome